Okay, hello. My name is Leonardo Giordano. Today I'm going to be talking about the Italian Renaissance artist Sofonisba Anguissola for the Women in the Middle Ages class. Right. A bit about her upbringing. She was born in Cremona, a northern province in Italy's Lombard region, once again covering another Lombardy woman, between the years of either 1532 or 1535. Her parents were Amilcare Anguissola and Bianca Ponzone, both of whom were noble. And together they had seven children, of which Sofonisba herself was the oldest, and apparently there was only one brother. Apparently, the family lived in an area which was nearby to the site of the ancient Battle of Trebia, which was fought between the ancient Romans and Carthaginians, North Africans. And Sofonisba was named after a Carthaginian tragic figure. Sofonisba, same name, different spelling with a PH instead of an F, who was Carthaginian. This would not be the first person in the family who would have a name with that kind of origin. Her father, Amilcare, he was heavily inspired by the philosophical text Il Cortegiano, which was written by Baldassare Castiglione. This book detailed the proper ways to live as a court member, either a lady or a man, I suppose. And it was between this text and his humanist beliefs that Amilcare prompted all of his daughters, yes, all of them, to pursue the arts. A bit about her early education now. So in this time period, it wasn't really common that women of young women of nobility were typically educated in the arts. If anything, it was usually music, languages, or something more modest like sketching or needlepoint. Normally, if you were a woman, you'd have to have or receive education from a family member who was a male who was already established in the art scene. Sofonisba did not have this, but because her family had various aristocratic connections, her father pulled some strings such that Sofonisba and some of her younger sisters could study under the tutelage of Bernardino Campi and Bernardino Ghetti. It's curious that they both have the same first name, but please note that they are two separate people. This image here we can see, although it's painted by Sofonisba herself, it does depict Campi painting a portrait of her, which I think is a bit of a curious inception. So she showed a great deal of promise, and as such, her father Amilcare arranged for her to go to Rome. And it was during this time that she ran into Michelangelo. Well, not ran into, I think they were arranged to have met, who was already at this point in his 70s while she was only 22. And this all took place in the mid 1550s or so. Apparently, he was greatly impressed by the talent and promise that she showed as an artist. And as such, he kind of introduced her to a bit of a exercise, if you will. He showed her a drawing of a laughing girl, and in response was told, or rather, Sofonisba said, "I'm going to do something that's opposite of this." So she drew an image of her younger brother, whose name is Asdrubale, which I mentioned as before, also stems from another Carthaginian character, I believe the younger brother of Hannibal, who was a statesman. And you can see, although it's hard to tell, that this is his finger being bitten by a crayfish. Sometimes it's called a lobster, but needless to say. So again, because of how impressed Michelangelo was, Sofonisba ended up studying with him while in Rome informally for about 2 years or so. It was then that she would return to her hometown of Cremona, or her home region rather. And it was kind of during this point that she would again continue to practice doing portraiture, and she would also take up the role of painting higher ranking members of society. So, sorry, I realize that I'm in the way. This particular portrait of Massimiliano Il Stampa, he's a youth, he's a member of nobility, and he is essentially a marquis. I don't necessarily know what role that is, but think probably something like a duke. And she was responsible for painting him. And notably, while many of her other figures are seated, this fellow is standing. And there's also a dog. I don't usually see a lot of animals in her work, but that's neither here nor there. Um, Oops, sorry. In addition to that, she also produced around this time, the mid 1550s, one of her most famous pieces, according to the National Women's Museum of Art. This is called Chess Game. This shows it's a bit of a family portrait, I suppose you could say, which is frequently the subject matter that Anguissola relied on for practicing portraiture. I believe these are her various sisters, and the woman on the far right there, because she's so matronly, I assume she's some kind of nurse or aide. I don't believe that's the mother. There are other pictures of her, and that does not seem to resemble her. Apparently, again, according to the same institution, this portrait is one of the Italian Cinquecento's finest works, which that means the Italian 500. I guess that just refers to the 16th century as a whole, but evidently that this picture is a hallmark of that era. Um, More about its subject matter, it's intended to show women's intellectual pursuits of her time. The psychological approach to a lot of her portraiture will become relevant when I discuss it in the following slides, but that is an angle at which Sofonisba liked to approach some of her portraiture. And again, we can see just how ornate some of the detailing is and how her skill has really improved from her earlier days. She also liked to practice self-portraits. In fact, I think for women of her time, I believe she had produced the most of herself, something like 20, I believe I read. In particular, she liked to describe and display herself as a virtuous, honorous, and pious, I guess, at some points, woman, excuse me. And in particular, there is some Latin text on here that translates to Sofonisba Anguissola, created by the young maiden herself, which I believe is what's written here. And that just kind of expresses her own abilities and not only her ability to paint, but her legibility and the fact that I don't know, I guess it's one way of signing it, I suppose you could say. This particular portrait here, which is a smaller piece, looks like it might have been part of a locket, perhaps. It also has a translation on it, which, while I don't necessarily know what the whole of it means, I think her hand is covering this particular word, Virgo, which translates from Latin to mean like a young virginal woman, which is also, again, trying to communicate how she thought of herself and wanted people to view her. So her skills were growing, obviously, and reached a degree of national renown, or international renown, excuse me, as well as national, though that's true. And she was invited personally by King Philip II of Spain to come work in his court. And it was here that a great deal of things happened, such as, well, first she had to move to Madrid, and that was about in 1558. And it was during this point that she then held a 14-year residency. Namely, in particular, prior to her arrival, there was a bit of a gold standard set by another artist whose name was Alonso Sanchez Coelho, and he was recognized as the portraitist of the king, who defined a bit of a gold standard for paintings within the court. And while Sofonisba certainly adhered to some of this, she certainly had her own stylings and tempered these. I'll read a quote here that says, a meticulous description of details, a psychological perception that tempers the distance and restraint characteristic of the Spanish Habsburgs, and an all-enveloping and filtered light which softens the figure's outlines. I believe that was almost a contemporary quote as well. But in particular, some of the other things that she was responsible for doing, in addition to portraiture, was to give private drawing lessons to the Queen, who here is Elizabeth of Valois, I believe, I think the first or second wife of Philip. And in addition to that, she would also receive gifts. In addition to the stipend for doing the work, she would apparently receive gifts of expensive clothing and jewelry. And furthermore, she was also responsible for sometimes caring for, but also influencing the art education of Elizabeth's daughter, the Infanta, who I believe was named Isabel. Yes, in this case. Unfortunately, many of the works, it seems like, although there are a handful that still survive, I think a great deal of them were lost to a fire within the court, unfortunately. But we do have a few pictures, especially this one here of King Philip himself. So, unfortunately, following the early demise of Elizabeth in the year 1568, Philip II, he would arrange Sofonisba to be married to a Sicilian nobleman whose name was Fabrizio Moncada Pignatelli in the year 1571. Although he would be noble, as I guess perhaps that could have stood in the way, he was overall supportive of her pursuit of a career in the arts, and his money allowed her to continue to do that when they would return to Sicily in 1573. And quickly to backtrack, it is also worth noting that Sofonisba's father did not necessarily intend for her career to become so professional, and he was instead interested in securing dowries for all of his female children, which was the majority of the kids that he had. But nonetheless, he was still supportive and was openly supportive of her career and advertised it to many friends, which I think in some places is how she got to work with Michelangelo, as well as perhaps influencing her journey to Madrid. So they returned to Sicily. The Sicilian nobleman and Sofonisba returned to Sicily in the year 1573. It was there that Anguissola continued to be a local painter, and she would also tutor in the arts. And as mentioned before, her husband's wealth also combined with a stipend from the royal work that she did of 100 ducats. I don't know how much money that is in today's, continued to fund her creative endeavors. It was in 1579 that Pignatelli would also unfortunately pass away, and it was sometime shortly after this that uh, Anguissola would return to her hometown of Cremona, and apparently because she took a ship, she fell in love with its captain, Orazio Lomellino. They wed in Pisa in 1584 and would settle in Genoa, where again she would assume the role of a local portraitist and continue to garner fame and recognition both internationally and within Italy itself. She also, in addition to that point, she also gained a bit of recognition from particular people such as Giorgio Vasari, who was a contemporary who was an art historian. Apparently, he was exposed to some of her works in his father's workshop. I'm not necessarily sure how they ended up there. And in 1609, Sofonisba was also extensively written about in the published works of the Valencian author Pedro Pablo de Ribeira. Um, in her final years, she lived to be about 92, although some accounts say as late as 97. It was in her final years or months even that while she was in Italy, she was visited by the Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck, who was at this point rather young, and he was curious to know about her techniques and wanted advice from Anguissola. And during their visit, he sketched her and he drew sketches of her and created one of the last portraits, which we can see right here. It was also, uh, I suppose, that she allowed him to study her notes and her past works. And from this, I'm sure he gained, excuse me, a great deal of information that influenced his own artistic style. But that's outside of the scope of my discussion. So that is about all I have to say. Unfortunately, she did pass away, and she was outlived by her husband, who left an inscription on the tomb that said something to the effect of, "To Safonisba, my wife, who is recorded among the illustrious women of the world, outstanding in portraying the images of man, Orazio Lomellino, in sorrow for the loss of his great love." So, yeah, she certainly left a mark for herself, and because she was a woman, broke so many barriers between even achieving education. It just happened to help that she was noble, but normally it wouldn't have been traditional because none of the other members of her immediate family were within the arts career, and that she got to work for the esteemed King Philip of Spain was also rather interesting, if you ask me. Um, in lieu of her death, she would kind of fall out of favor, obviously, or rather fall out of public eye. And it wasn't really until about the 1970s that she was picked up again, and her art has since been collected by various public and private institutions and been put on various displays since. Again, as I mentioned before, the National Women's Museum of Art had an exhibit featuring many of her works, and I believe even some of her sisters in as recent as 2015. And that is all. Thank you very much.